People are always shocked when an empath disappears. No argument, no dramatic goodbye, no long explanation, just silence. One day they are present, listening, supporting, absorbing everything. The next day they are gone. And the people left behind ask the same question over and over again. What just happened? What they don't realize is this empaths don't leave suddenly. They leave after staying too long. This video will reveal the hidden psychological shift that causes this quiet exit. A shift so subtle most people never see it coming. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why empath detachment feels so confusing, so final, and so impossible to reverse. Empaths don't detach because they stop caring. They detach because caring without limits becomes dangerous. For a long time, they give without keeping score. They excuse behavior. They justify neglect. They believe understanding will eventually be returned. But something important is happening beneath the surface. While others see patience, the empath is gathering data. Every broken promise, every one-sided conversation, every moment their emotions were ignored. This information is stored quietly, not as resentment, but as awareness. And once awareness reaches a certain point, the relationship is never the same again. This is the part most people don't know. Detachment doesn't begin with anger. It begins with clarity. What confuses people the most is the lack of explanation. The empath used to explain everything. They tried to be understood. They tried to fix emotional gaps. So when they finally stop talking, it feels cold, cruel even. But the truth is far more complex. By the time an empath goes silent, they have already said everything, just not out loud. They spoke through patience, through forgiveness, through staying when leaving would have been easier. When those signals were ignored, something inside them shifted. They realized explaining costs energy, and energy is no longer available to people who don't listen. Silence becomes efficiency. Distance becomes peace. And this is where the real detachment begins. Here steps the lesser-known truth. Empath detachment is not emotional shutdown. It is emotional relocation. They stop pouring into places that leak. They stop proving their worth to people who never questioned their absence. This shift happens quietly, internally, and completely. One moment they realize their nervous system is calmer without certain people around. That realization is powerful, because once peace is felt, chaos becomes intolerable. This is why their absence feels permanent. Not because they can return, but because returning would mean betraying the version of themselves that finally chose safety. Detachment for an empath is not punishment. It is survival with dignity. If you've ever been confused by an empath's silence, or if you are an empath who has felt guilty for walking away without explanation, this video is for you. Because what looks like disappearance is actually transformation. And what feels like abandonment is often self-respect awakening. By watching until the end, you'll understand why this shift happens, why it feels irreversible, and why empath detachment is one of the most misunderstood emotional responses in human psychology. Stay with this message, because once you understand the shift, you'll never see silence the same way again. From the outside, empath detachment looks sudden, like a switch flipped overnight. One day they are present, warm, responsive. The next day they are distant or completely gone. But this disappearance is never impulsive. It is the final stage of a long internal journey that most people never notice. Empaths don't announce their discomfort. They don't threaten to leave. They don't create drama to be seen. Instead, they observe quietly. They adjust silently. They give themselves chances to feel better. And when nothing changes, they keep going anyway. Others miss the signs because the empath never complains out loud. They smile through discomfort. They reassure instead of accuse. They stay calm when something inside them is slowly breaking. What people don't realize is that empaths process emotions internally first. Long before they pull away physically, they have already pulled back emotionally. They ask themselves difficult questions in silence. They notice patterns without naming them. They feel the heaviness before they understand it. Every time their needs are overlooked, they tell themselves it's not a big deal. Every time they feel drained, they assume they just need more rest. They give the benefit of the doubt again and again. This is why detachment looks sudden, because all the emotional work happened invisibly. By the time others notice the distance, the empath has already reached clarity, and clarity does not come with chaos. It comes with calm resolve. At the center of this process is emotional overgiving. Empaths give before they are asked. They listen without interrupting. They remember details others forget. They sense moods before words are spoken. They absorb emotions that don't belong to them. If someone is anxious, they feel it. If someone is sad, they carry it. If someone is overwhelmed, they step in without being invited. This is not something they consciously choose. It is how they are wired. They take responsibility for emotional harmony even when it costs them. And because they don't ask for much in return, people assume they need nothing. Over time, this pattern becomes heavy. Emotional weight builds quietly. The empath becomes tired without knowing why. Conversations start to feel draining instead of nourishing. Being around certain people feels like work instead of connection. But still, they keep giving. They tell themselves this is what love looks like. They believe their role is to be strong, understanding, patient. What they don't see at first is that overgiving slowly disconnects them from themselves. Their own feelings get postponed. Their own needs get minimized. Their inner voice gets quieter. And exhaustion sets in not as anger, but as numbness. Eventually something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically. The empath notices how much energy they give compared to how little they receive. They notice how often they are the emotional support, but rarely the emotional priority. They notice how their absence would go unnoticed, but their presence is always expected. This realization doesn't cause an argument. It causes distance, because once an empath understands that constant giving is unsustainable, they stop explaining and start protecting. They don't detach to hurt anyone. They detach because staying connected means losing themselves. There comes a moment when something subtle shifts inside an empath. It doesn't arrive as anger. It doesn't come with confrontation. It arrives as awareness, a quiet, almost uncomfortable clarity. They begin to notice patterns they once ignored. Small things at first, who checks on them without being prompted, who only reaches out when they need something, who disappears the moment the empath shows fatigue, sadness, or vulnerability. These observations don't make the empath bitter. They make the empath awake. And once this awareness begins, it cannot be undone, because seeing imbalance changes how everything feels. At this stage, the empath starts mentally replaying interactions, not to judge, but to understand. They realize how often they initiate contact, how often they carry conversations, how often they offer emotional support that is never returned. They notice how their presence is expected, but their absence is tolerated. This isn't about keeping score. It's about noticing energy flow. Empaths are deeply sensitive to emotional exchange. And when that exchange becomes one-sided, the body feels it before the mind accepts it. Tightness in the chest, a quiet fatigue after certain conversations, a sense of being unseen even while being needed. This awareness doesn't demand action yet. It simply sits there waiting to be acknowledged. At the same time, an intense inner conflict begins. Empaths hate disappointing people. They were often praised for being understanding, patient, and kind. So they learn to equate love with endurance. Walking away feels cruel. Setting boundaries feels selfish. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being labeled cold, distant, or uncaring. So they stay longer than they should. They explain things away in their own mind. They tell themselves others are trying their best. They convince themselves to wait just a little longer, even when it hurts. Even when something inside them is quietly asking for relief, This is the most exhausting phase for an empath because they are aware of the imbalance, yet emotionally trapped by guilt. They feel torn between self-respect and loyalty, between honesty and harmony. They can sense that something is wrong, but they don't want to hurt anyone by acknowledging it, so they compromise with themselves instead. They suppress discomfort. They delay decisions. They keep giving while feeling increasingly empty. Outwardly, nothing changes. Inwardly, everything does. The empath becomes quieter, less reactive, less emotionally available. Not because they care less, but because caring has begun to cost too much. Eventually, the weight of this inner conflict becomes impossible to ignore. The empath realizes that staying is slowly erasing them, that constantly choosing others over themselves is not kindness, but self-abandonment. This realization doesn't make them angry. It makes them sad, calm, and resolved. They understand that being good to everyone has meant being unfair to themselves. And while they may still smile, still listen, still show up for a while longer, something fundamental has shifted. They are no longer blind to imbalance. And once an empath sees where their energy is not valued, they can never unsee it. Long before an empath decides to detach, their body begins to speak. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. There is a constant tension that never fully goes away. Shoulders stay tight even at rest. Sleep no longer feels restorative. Thoughts feel cloudy, slow, scattered. The empath struggles to explain this exhaustion because nothing obvious is wrong. They are not in crisis. They are not in conflict. Yet they feel drained all the time. This is emotional fatigue reaching a breaking point, and it has nothing to do with weakness. It is the result of carrying too much for too long. Mental fog begins to settle in. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel effortful. Small decisions feel heavy. Joy feels distant. The empath may notice moments of emotional numbness, and this is confusing for someone who feels deeply. They wonder what's happening to them. They tell themselves they should be more grateful, more patient, more understanding. But the truth is simple. The nervous system is overwhelmed. When emotional input exceeds emotional recovery, the system shuts down to survive. This numbness is not indifference. It is protection, a pause, a signal that the empath has been giving from an empty place. During this phase, the empath often pushes harder instead of resting. They show up even when they feel depleted. They listen even when they have nothing left to give. They override their own signals because they've learned to prioritize others. But the body keeps count. Every ignored boundary, every unspoken need. Every time they choose peace for others at the cost of themselves. Eventually something gives, not in an explosion, but in a quiet internal collapse. The empath realizes they can no longer function the way they used to. And this moment is uncomfortable, disorienting, and deeply revealing. Then comes the hidden shift. It doesn't arrive with anger or blame. There is no desire to punish anyone. Something simply clicks. A calm realization settles in. Love should not require self-abandonment. Care should not feel like depletion. Connection should not come at the cost of inner stability. This awareness is subtle but powerful. For the first time, the empath stops asking, "How can I make this work?" and starts asking, "Why am I the only one holding this together?" That question changes everything. This is the true turning point, not anger, not revenge, not bitterness, just awareness. Self-respect awakens quietly without drama. The empath sees that their exhaustion is not a personal failure, but a signal that something must change. And they no longer feel the urge to explain themselves to people who never noticed their struggle. They no longer feel guilty for needing space. Their energy begins to turn inward, toward healing, toward stability, toward themselves. And once self-respect awakens, the empath cannot return to unconscious overgiving, because awareness once gained does not fade. There was a time when the empath explained everything. They explained their feelings, their reactions, their silence, their need for space. They believed clarity would create understanding. They believed if they found the right words, the right tone, the right moment, things would finally change. So they tried again and again, but over time explaining stopped feeling helpful. It started feeling heavy, draining, because the empath noticed a painful truth. The people who didn't listen before weren't confused. They were uninterested, and no amount of explaining can create care where none exists. This realization changes how the empath communicates. They stop defending their feelings. They stop justifying their boundaries. They stop translating their inner world for people who never tried to understand it. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Explaining requires emotional energy, and emotional energy has become precious. They understand that if someone truly wanted to know, they would have paid attention earlier. They would have noticed the discomfort, the withdrawal, the quiet attempts to be heard. By the time words are exhausted, silence becomes the most honest response. Silence for the empath is not avoidance. It is alignment. It is the moment they choose inner peace over endless emotional labor. They realize that over-explaining keeps them stuck in roles they've outgrown. The role of the fixer, the emotional translator, the one who makes everything make sense for everyone else. Letting go of explanation feels uncomfortable at first because they were conditioned to believe they owe people access. But slowly silence begins to feel lighter, cleaner. It creates space where exhaustion once lived. And in that space, the empath can finally breathe. As explanation fades, detachment naturally follows. Distance is no longer punishment. It is safety. The empath steps back not to teach anyone a lesson, but to restore balance within themselves. They notice how calm returns when certain conversations stop, how their body relaxes when they are no longer bracing for emotional misunderstandings. This distance is intentional, protective. It is the empath choosing not to reopen wounds that took years to heal. Not everyone is meant to have unlimited access. And realizing this is not cruelty, it is maturity. Silence becomes a boundary, not a weapon. It is not used to control or manipulate. It is used to preserve, to protect emotional stability, to maintain clarity. The empath no longer needs to announce their boundaries because their absence communicates enough. They trust that the right people will understand without explanation. And those who don't were never listening in the first place. This is where detachment settles in fully, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with quiet self-respect. When detachment finally happens, people often say it came without warning. They feel blindsided, confused, abandoned. But from the empath's perspective, the warnings were always there. They just weren't said loud. Empaths, dynasty, issue ultimatums. They don't threaten to leave to be taken seriously. Their warnings come in softer forms, through patience that stretches longer than it should, through tolerance that quietly absorbs discomfort, through emotional labor that fills in gaps others never notice. These were the signals. They were simply easy to overlook. In the past, the empath gave warning after warning through their behavior. They stayed even when it hurt. They explained gently instead of confronting harshly. They adjusted themselves to keep the peace. They forgave quickly. They waited patiently for change. Each of these actions was a form of communication, a way of saying, this matters to me. But because these warnings didn't come with anger or drama, they weren't taken seriously. They blended into the background. People assumed the empath would always understand, always adapt, always stay. Over time, the empath noticed something painful. Their effort was invisible. Their patience was mistaken for comfort. Their tolerance was mistaken for acceptance. And their emotional labor was mistaken for obligation. So they stopped signaling, not out of resentment, but because signaling hadn't yet worked. They realized that repeating the same quiet warnings would only lead to the same outcome. More giving, more waiting, more self-betrayal. At this point, detachment becomes the only language left. This is why there is no announcement this time. No explanation, no final conversation. Because from the empath's view, the conversation has been happening for a long time. It just wasn't sight or heard. Detachment arrives not as a reaction, but as a conclusion reached after observing patterns, testing patience, and exhausting emotional reserves. By the time the empath leaves, there is nothing left to say. They are not angry. They are resolved. And resolution does not need to be announced. The absence of warning feels harsh to those left behind, but for the empath, it is an act of mercy toward themselves. They understand now that continuing to warn someone who chooses not to listen only deepens the wound. So they choose silence instead. They choose distance over explanation. They choose peace over proving a point. And that is why detachment feels sudden, because the loudest warning was never the words. It was the patience that finally ran out. Once detachment takes place, something unexpected happens. The empath doesn't feel empty. They feel lighter. The constant emotional noise begins to fade. There is no longer a need to anticipate moods, manage reactions, or absorb unspoken tension. For the first time in a long while, the empath's inner world becomes quiet. This calm is unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious. They wonder if something is missing. But what sets missing is not love. It sets chaos. The nervous system begins to settle in ways the empath didn't realize were possible. Shoulders relax without conscious effort. Breathing deepens naturally. Sleep slowly improves. The body is no longer in a constant state of alertness. There is no need to prepare explanations or emotional defenses. No need to monitor tone or timing. The empath isn't set reacting anymore. They are resting. This shift is subtle but powerful because the body finally understands that it is safe, and safety changes everything. With calm comes clarity. Thoughts that once felt tangled begin to organize themselves. The empath starts seeing situations as they truly were, not as they hoped they would be. They recognize patterns clearly. Who drained them? Who valued their energy? Who only showed up when it was convenient? This clarity doesn't hurt the way it once might have. It feels grounding. It confirms that detachment was not a mistake, but a correction. The empath is no longer confused by mixed signals or emotional inconsistency. Distance removes distortion, and in that space, truth becomes obvious. Peace replaces confusion slowly, then all at once. There is no longer an inner debate about staying or leaving, no emotional tug of war. The empath no longer asks why things felt so hard. They feel the answer in their body. Life becomes simpler, not easier in every way, but cleaner. Interactions feel intentional. Energy feels contained. The empath begins to enjoy their own presence again. They reconnect with interests that were forgotten, with emotions that were muted, with a sense of self that was once buried under responsibility for others. This calm does not come from shutting down emotionally. It comes from choosing environments that do not demand constant emotional labor. The empath realizes that peace is not something to chase. It is something to protect. And once they experience life without emotional chaos, they understand something deeply important. They were never too sensitive. They were simply in places that required them to be on guard. Detachment didn't make them cold. It made them whole again. Once an empath detaches, something fundamental changes inside.